We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. America as a nation began after the Declaration of Independence, promising to the people that they would not rule them as they were once ruled by Britain. But America broke that promise when they decided to close the door on the Chinese. Under the Declaration of Independence, the American government had the responsibility to protect the basic human rights of all people, but it ignored its responsibility and took away the rights of the Chinese. America is a nation built on immigrants. The Statue of Liberty became a symbol of America's open immigration, despite the Chinese Exclusion Act passed 4 years earlier. The gold rush of 1848 urged many Chinese to come to America in search of gold and job opportunities. They came with the expectations of finding freedom and a better life, but after working hard to help build the nation, the Chinese were repaid with a law forbidding them from coming to America, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The Chinese worked day after day helping to build the transcontinental railroads. They worked the most dangerous jobs and earned the lowest wages.
And I have to give those early immigrants a lot of credit for living such miserable lives, and yet they survive. They survive.
The Irish workers, led primarily by Dennis Kearney, blamed the Chinese for taking away their jobs and appealed for a joint commission from Congress to establish immigration laws against the Chinese. The Irish also felt threatened by the incoming wave of an unfamiliar alien culture.
Here they're trapped in a country that didn't want them. It was official. We don't want your type. You can't become American.
In response to the prejudices, the Chinese built Chinatowns as safe havens from the hatred of the non-Asian Americans. Congress ignored its promise to protect the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness of all people, and under the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Chinese no longer had any rights simply because they were Chinese.
Chinese were the first group to be singled out as not being worthy of coming to this country. How it lasted for 61 years is just a real black mark on this country's history.
The Chinese could not come to America, they could not become American citizens, and they were left to protect themselves from the now legal discriminatory acts from other non-Asian Americans.
So there's the first step of immigration law that dictated who could be American and who couldn't be American. And each successive law, even after the Chinese Exclusion Law, allowed certain types of people to come in and certain people to stay out.
The Chinese who were already in America couldn't do anything to ensure that they would be treated as equal human beings because in the eyes of many other Americans, they were inferior creatures. Many Chinese tried to bring their wrongdoings to the courtroom, but the trials were biased and racist, leaving the Chinese to feel inferior, hopeless, and helpless. Even though the Chinese population in America significantly declined in the years after the act was passed, the Chinese continued to persist, and in 1898, one immigrant changed a fundamental part of America's policy. In the Supreme Court case United States versus Wong Kim Ark, one man brought to light the inequality between Asian and non-Asian immigrants, convincing the court to legally establish American birthright citizenship.
Provided that no alien ineligible to become a citizen could be admitted to the U.S. as an immigrant. Because of him, or because of the ruling in his case, anyone who was born here is a citizen, and that holds true for the children of undocumented people.
Even after instituting birthright citizenship, the Chinese were still alienated and dehumanized. They were sent to immigration stations such as Angel Island, where they would be interrogated with unfair, unreasonable questions to prevent them from coming to the United States. They were detained in prison-like detention barracks for days, weeks, or months, depending on their monetary wealth and social class.
When we walked in, the guard would close the door, locked it. The windows barred. We felt like prisoners. We were not allowed to go in and out.
At Angel Island, the Chinese left historic landmarks on the walls of the detention halls in the form of poetry.
We Chinese of a weak nation can only sigh at the lack of freedom.
The poems describe the hardships the Chinese had to face when simply trying to enter the land of opportunity. In 1910, the immigration station was moved from San Francisco to Angel Island, where the Chinese had little to no rights at all. To avoid being deported because they failed to meet the interrogation requirements, Chinese men in America would send coaching papers to their family members back in China. The coaching papers provided the incoming Chinese with the answers they would need to be fully prepared for the long interrogation process. The Chinese refused to give up their rights and decided to defy the Chinese Exclusion Act. They would circumvent the law by lying about who they were and come to America.
You get interrogated, and if you pass the test, if you could somehow show that you're the son of this person, you could get in. And so a lot of Chinese pretended to be the sons or daughters of American citizens and passed the test at Angel Island and were able to get in.
The 1906 earthquake and fire in San Francisco enabled the Chinese to quickly immigrate into America as paper sons and paper daughters.
The Hall of Records burned down, and they put out the call saying, well, we'd like everybody to come help us recreate these records. Naturally, the Chinese would claim that they were born here and claim they had several children in China.
The Chinese realized that the only way for them to protect their basic human rights was to come together to form the Chinese SITS companies to help struggling Chinese Americans adapt to the harsh American atmosphere.
So the SITS companies was just one of the organizations that challenged both the legality and the implementation of the Chinese Exclusion Act.
They tried to convince Congress to pass legislation to regulate the Chinese immigration laws, but to little or no avail. The Chinese SITS company still exists today, helping overseas immigrants.
The Chinese exclusion law gave the United States a precedent to allow certain people to come in, to exclude certain people, and to include certain people.
The Chinese Exclusion Act was originally supposed to be repealed 10 years after it was passed, but Congress kept extending the act until the world plunged into World War II.
When it was renewed again in 1902, they did not set a 10-year amendment. Whereas its first, 1882 and 1892 was for 10 years. In 1902, there was no closing date. So that's why it was indefinite until it was repealed in 1943.
The act was finally repealed in 1943, but it wasn't out of regret for the wrongs placed on the Chinese. It was because America wanted to protect the country's reputation and credibility to help win the war.
In 1943, it was finally repealed because China was an ally. There was a fair amount of propaganda by the Japanese saying, how can Chinese fight for this country when they can't even become citizens, when they're not even supposed to be here? And China was then an ally, of course, during the war, and so the U.S. repealed the act.
The lack of protection of Chinese American rights wasn't apologized for until over a century later. In 2011, the United States finally realized the wrongdoings they placed on a hard-working people.
Today we announce a bill to address a terrible travesty of justice, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Today we unveil our legislation for Congress to atone for the mistakes of the past that deprived Chinese Americans of basic rights for 60 years.
The government finally took responsibility of its actions when it formally apologized to the Chinese, even though they apologized a century too late.
No more. From now on, not one particular ethnic group should be selected and excluded. This is absolutely unfair. It has caused a lot of heartaches. It has caused a lot of bad feelings on the immigrants.
In order to guarantee equal rights for all, we must learn from our mistakes to ensure that no person loses his basic human rights and that the government lives up to its responsibility of protecting the rights of all people, despite their ethnic background.